Welcome to Global Power Shift. I'm Jim Stenman, joined by Suzanne Kianpour in Washington. Today, we're going to be speaking to Sir Bill Browder, once the largest portfolio investor in Russia until he was expelled after exposing corruption in Russian state-linked companies. After the death of his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, in a Moscow prison, Browder led a campaign for the Magnitsky sanctions, a model that now echoes across multiple democracies. And he was also knighted in the UK in 2024 for his services to human rights and anti-corruption. Today, we're going to ask what his Russia experience teaches us about Putin, power, money, Ukraine, Iran as well, and what Russia really wants on the global stage. As always, we invite all of our viewers and our listeners as well to follow Global Power Shift on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So just to kick things off, what does the grandson of one of America's most famous communists, how does he end up becoming one of Vladimir Putin's biggest enemies, I guess?
Well, so my grandfather, Earl Browder, was the general secretary of the American Communist Party between 1932 and 1945. Um, he was eventually expelled from the Communist Party for not being communist enough and then persecuted during the McCarthy era. But when I was going through my teenage rebellion in the 1970s, I was trying to figure out the best way of rebelling from this family of communists. And I put on a suit and tie and became a capitalist. And when the Berlin Wall came down, I had this epiphany, which is that if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America, I was going to try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And that's what I set out to do. I eventually moved to Russia, set up an investment fund called the Hermitage Fund, which became the largest foreign investment fund in the country. I started to experience terrible corruption in the companies I was investing in. I exposed that corruption, and that led to me to being expelled and all those things you described in my introduction. And so it's kind of a long pendulum swinging from one direction to the other. And here I am now. In a certain way, my grandfather became an enemy of Stalin, and I'm an enemy of Vladimir Putin. So there's all sorts of strange echoes in history in our story.
Did you feel like you were trying to rebel against your family history in a sense?
Absolutely. When I was growing up, I was totally rebelling against it. I couldn't see the virtue in any of the communist left wing philosophies of my family, and that's why I became a capitalist. Of course, none of these none of these economic programs are perfect, but capitalism is a lot better than communism, and no matter what.
You gave up your American citizenship in 1998, right? So looking back, was that practical, emotional, ideological? What was the motivation behind that?
Well, so coming back to my grandfather's story, so in the 1950s, during the McCarthy era, they were going after anybody who was communist, and of course, the leader of the Communist Party was definitely communist. And when they were persecuting my grandfather, and there's just unbelievable reams of transcripts from the House on Un-American activities and so on. But there was one really tragic incident involving my family, which really cast a dark pall over all of us, which is that my grandmother, my grandfather had met in Russia. So my grandmother was Russian. She came with my grandfather back to America, um, and she became an American citizen. And during this persecution, she was dying of cancer, and the equivalent of ICE at the time burst into their apartment and tried to detain her while she was on her deathbed and wanted to deport her back to Russia while she was dying. And I kind of felt like, and this was a long time ago. This was 26 years ago, or no longer than that, 28 years ago. I kind of felt like I had been living in London for about 10 years, and they granted me citizenship. And I kind of felt like Britain is the country of the Magna Carta. They had 1,000 years of institutions. And I kind of felt like America can really go off the deep end from time to time, as they had with my family. And I decided to give up my American citizenship and become British, not knowing what America was going to become 28 years later, with similar types of insanity, which is happening right now.
I think it would probably be fair to say that your interest in Russia and perhaps Eastern Europe, even more broadly, became bigger after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Can you talk about that and the sort of economic opportunities that it created for investors such as yourself, particularly in Russia?
So, as I mentioned, I went out there with this sort of romantic idea of, my grandfather was the communist, I'm going to be the capitalist. And I get out there, really not really understanding what the business opportunity was. But when I saw it, it was pretty unbelievable. Which was, in Russia in particular, they had made this decision that they wanted to go from communism to capitalism, and the best way to go from communism to capitalism would be to make everybody in the country capitalists. How would they do that? They were going to give away all state property, which was all the property, um, away effectively for free to the people of the country. And they did this through a variety of different means. But they called it the mass privatization program. And so after they were done with the mass privatization program, you had all these companies, these big oil companies, big gas companies, aluminum companies, steel companies, all these huge, huge companies that had been given to people for free. And then there was a stock exchange that started on the back of that for people if they wanted to sell their shares. And you could buy shares of these big Russian companies at a 99.8% discount to the valuation of similar companies in the West. So if you looked at oil companies, they were trading at 10 cents per barrel of proven reserves when an oil company in the West was trading at $20 per barrel of proven reserves. And I saw that and I said to myself, God, this is, you know, this has got to be one of the most unbelievable investment opportunities of all time if you can buy shares on the stock market of these companies at such a deep, deep discount.
Hmm.
One of two things could happen. Either they're gonna take them away from you, which you'd lose all your money, but if they don't take them away from you, you're gonna make 10, 20, 50, 100 times your money, and that for a lot of people, that happened.
So how did you end up in Putin's crosshairs then? You originally saw Putin as somebody who was bringing order. What do you think he understood that the oligarchs didn't?
Well, so originally, when we were in this transition period, so I got to Russia in 1996. This was the period of Boris Yeltsin, who was he was, remember, the guy who stood up on the tank when in Red Square, and he was sort of this really sort of impressive political figure, but he really, in order to get into power, he allowed 22 oligarchs to steal um, uh, 40% of the country from everybody else. And it really became a disgusting situation where the average life expectancy for a male was 58 years because people couldn't get health care. They were not eating properly. Everything was the stress of economic dislocation was, I mean, everything was really pretty bad for the people. And these 22 guys were living the life of unimaginable luxury at the expense of everybody else. And so everybody was desperate for somebody to come in and change it all. And so Putin shows up and he says, "We're going to get rid of the oligarchs and make it a normal country." And I cheered, and so did everybody else at the time. There was really nobody who wasn't cheering for some type of normalcy to come to the country. And for a few years, Putin was actually behaving as if he was a normal leader trying to do just that. Um, but it turns out that he was just not very secure in understanding sort of like where his power lied. And as he started to regain power, or gain power, I should say, um, there's this expression that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And he started to get he started to steal money, basically. And the way he would steal money would be through either extortion, um, just telling people that he would arrest them if they didn't hand over their money, or just passing over money that should have belonged to the state to himself and to his cronies. And I saw this in the companies that I was investing in. So I was investing in the largest companies in the country, and I saw this money being stolen. And originally it was being stolen by the oligarchs, and then it started being stolen by Putin. And I started to, in order to try to stop the stealing, I started scream bloody murder. And I went to the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and I shared with them granular, detailed stories of how the stealing was taking place. And as you can imagine, that didn't make me too popular. And I was first doing this against the oligarchs, but then it became clear that Putin was one of the beneficiaries, and he didn't want to have me around at that point, and so he uh, basically had my visa taken away when I was at the airport, and I was deported from the country, and I was never allowed in after 2005.
Do you think was there a particular kind of moment that switched with him, or was it gradual? I mean, I'm so curious about, power corrupting people. I mean, it sounds like you're saying genuinely Putin started out with altruistic motives for Russia.
Oh. No, I mean, I think he's always been a crook. If you read back into his history, he was sort of small time crook. Um, uh, but I think he when he got into power, he didn't really he wasn't really the president of Russia. He might have been president, but the president didn't have that much power. The oligarchs ran the roost. They were the ones with all the power. And so what had happened was that he was trying to figure out, how do I get the power back from the oligarchs? And so as he's clawed his way back with the power, um, uh, he started to enjoy the fruits of the power, and that was the corruption. And so the amount of power he got started to grow, and the amount of money that he stole started to grow. And a lot of people have asked, well, why did they just kick you out of Russia? Why didn't they kill you or arrest you? Because that's what they normally do in these types of situations. And the answer is that at that moment in time, in 2005, sort of 5 years after he'd become president, he wasn't all that confident the way he is right now. And and so to kill like the largest foreign investor in the country would have been so outrageous at that time that he just didn't have the guts to do it. And then the question is, well, why didn't they just arrest me? And again, he could have arrested me, but then every foreign leader would have been asking, for the release of Bill Browder, and he would have been as much a hostage to the situation as I was. And so at that time, and again, it's a lot different now. At that time, 2005, he thought the best way of getting me out of the picture was just to deport me, because he didn't have the guts to do all these more terrible things that he would certainly have the guts to do right now.
Little did he know. I think turning to kind of more present day now, the period in time that you're talking about is coming into focus now with regards to Iran, because given the war in Iran and the American and Israeli aims for regime change in Iran, there's a lot of talk of what comes after the Islamic Republic. And there has been discussion about the current president Pezeshkian being a sort of Gorbachev type figure. But those who are Russia experts like yourself have noted that after Gorbachev came Putin, there's this fear that the same would happen in Iran. Is this a sort of, I mean, is this a fear that you have in countries, like Russia, like Iran? Like, is this a pattern that is at risk of continuing in some of these other places where America has extracurricular activities, if you will?
Well, it's kind of hard to compare Russia to Iran, because they're totally different countries with different issues and different in a different situation. But to look at Iran right now, first of all, and I don't think anyone really knows how entrenched the regime is, who would take over, how it would happen. I mean, as everybody has said, you can't really predict regime change from the air. Um, uh, it's quite interesting when you look at what's going on in Iran, how the Israelis and the Americans are going about it. I mean, they're sort of got a list of people they want to take out, and they're taking them out one by one. And so, in theory, eventually, there'll be nobody left in the regime, and so maybe that is regime change. They're also attacking the security forces, and these people that have been terrorizing the normal citizens are all so scared they're sleeping in tents and sleeping in underground parking lots and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it's they're this is definitely wearing down the regime, but nobody knows how deep the regime goes, who would take over, what the continuation plans are from one person to the next, and how it all plays itself out. And I think it's just so hard to figure this out. And also the Iranians have had a lot of time to prepare themselves for this, and so it's not like this is all happening as a surprise. I mean, this has been threatened for a long time, and so, I mean, the way I look at it right now is this is kind of from a from a strategic standpoint, that it's kind of an even battle because the economic pain that's being inflicted on the world is equal to the military pain that's being inflicted on Iran, and it's kind of hard to see um, who might blink first.
But Putin is benefiting from this.
Putin is absolutely benefiting from this. I mean, he is benefiting in just about every possible way. So he's benefiting in that oil, which is his main source of revenue. The oil price has gone up dramatically. He's benefiting in that for reasons that are pretty much inexplicable. Um, the U.S. government has lifted sanctions temporarily on Putin's oil, which means that with oil price up as much as it's up, the sanctions, lifting the sanctions has led to the discount that Russia was forced to endure to go away. So there's no longer a discount between Russian oil and oil from the West. And so Russia has probably just this month has been given a $10 billion gift from the higher oil prices and the lapse or the waiver of sanctions. And then on top of that, he's been fighting this pretty much hopeless war in Ukraine. When I say hopeless, the Russians have been at it for 4 years. The Ukrainians have figured out how to stop Russia from advancing completely. Russia's not advancing in Ukraine, even though they try to. Every troop that they put into battle basically gets liquidated because of the expertise that Ukraine has with drone warfare. I mean, they've mastered drone warfare. They produce 7 million drones a year, and the Russians can't get within 100 miles of the Ukrainian border without dying on the ground. And so that's been a problem for Putin. And so the way that he's trying to win this war is by just bombing civilian infrastructure, bombing heating plants in the winter, bombing electricity plants, bombing, just demoralizing people in the big cities of Ukraine, killing civilians just indiscriminately. And some of that has been thwarted by anti-missile air defense. And where did that air defense come from? It came from the United States. But all of a sudden, the United States needs all the air defense they can come up with for the war in Iran, with all the bombs being lobbed into the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Israel, etc. And so Ukraine's not going to get any more weapons. And then also we now have this situation where Donald Trump, after discovering that Iran had this huge trump card up their sleeve, which is to close the Strait of Hormuz, which is then pushing oil prices up to unprecedented levels. He wants to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. He's gone out to all of his all the people who he thought of he could call on to help him, and they're saying, well, no, you were talking about invading Greenland a couple of months ago. We're not going to help you on Strait of Hormuz. And all of a sudden, he's now saying, well, if that's the case, then maybe NATO or the U.S. involvement in NATO shouldn't exist. And so I think there's a reasonably high probability that he withdraws America from NATO. And so that would be another big benefit to Putin, because Europe without the United States and NATO is a much softer target. So he's sitting there counting all of his wins and thinking to himself, Putin is thinking to himself, this is just probably better than he could have ever hoped for. And of course, it's also nice for him to see the whole world sort of fighting, and so he's not the only one fighting. Everybody is fighting.
We've seen Ukraine, I guess, at this point, leveraging their expertise when it comes to Shahid drones. I'm talking about the Gulf countries in particular. Is there anything else that Ukraine can do to leverage that even further in terms of, the war with Ukraine? We know that Russia remains a close ally of Gulf countries. So I don't know if you have any reflections on that in particular.
Well, I mean, allies, not allies, none of these things matter anymore. It's all just,
Mhm.
I mean, it's just, the sands are shifting every second. What I can tell you is that every hotel in Kyiv is full right now with buyers from the Middle East who are trying to do deals with the Ukrainians to get any type of drone defense from the Ukrainians, because they've had 4 years to get pretty good at this, and they've gotten pretty good at this. And this is their both, I would say, very relevant soft power right now, is to be able to uh, provide this type of equipment and technology and know-how to Middle Eastern countries, who, by the way, had pretty much ignored all of Ukraine's troubles for 4 years. I mean, none of these countries could have given a damn about Ukraine, but now they're all hat in hand. And of course, that can be interesting and helpful to Ukraine in a complicated world, and particularly if this type of air defense proves useful to the Saudis and to the Emiratis and so on. That could be a powerful force. And on top of that, of course, is just the money that Ukraine is not going to be doing this for free. They're going to be charging money, and that money can then be used for their own production and their own continuation of their defense.
So, what are you hearing specifically in terms of Middle East buyers coming to Kiev? Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Well, I mean, I don't have the names of the buyers, but what I can tell you is I heard from a friend of mine that you can't get a room in Kiev right now because they're all full of Middle East buyers trying to get their hands on any type of drone technology, because nobody had it just doesn't make sense. If the Iranians have a $20,000 drone to spend a $4 million Patriot missile to knock it out, and everyone's running out of air defense, because this thing has been going on for a long time. Having said that, of course, the Iranians are also running out of stuff. I mean, the number of projectiles coming from Iran to the Gulf has dropped by about 90%. But still, I mean, it has to drop by 100% before anyone can get back to business. And the fact that they're not getting back to business is proving to be, economically catastrophic for the Gulf and for the rest of the world.
So Russia is obviously benefiting from this in terms of short-term disruption. But if we think a little bit more long-term, if there were to be a regime change in Iran, how does that impact Russia, and how does that impact Putin in particular? Because it feels like he's losing friends on the international stage. Obviously, I'm thinking specifically about Syria, Venezuela. Dynamics have changed there as well, and we're all looking to Cuba now as well. So how do you see all of that playing out if there is regime change in Iran?
Well, I think that it's well, I mean, first of all, there has been some regime change. The Americans killed his friend, the 86-year-old Ayatollah. He's dead. Okay, so that, I mean, that is that I mean, the overall regime hasn't changed, but when Putin sees that, he sees his pal Khamenei killed. He sees his pal Maduro grabbed. He sees his pal Assad run out of the country. And these are just the big ones. I mean, he thought he had control over Armenia, and all of a sudden the Azeris take over Nagorno-Karabakh, which is something that the Russians should have offered to protect. And God knows what's happening in all sorts of situations in Africa that nobody's paying any attention to. But Putin, who had been in this sort of superpower position, or trying to look like a superpower world leader, has seen everybody who he promised protection and alliance fail, and that's a pretty bad thing to have, both on an international scale, so people can't count on him and can't necessarily rely on him, and therefore doing deals with him are not as useful. And it's pretty terrible for him on a domestic basis as well, because his whole thing is that he's a strong man. He projects power all over the world, and if that power is pretty much fake, and people can see that, that doesn't help him domestically. And interestingly, what's going on in Russia right now is that they have turned off the internet in Moscow. I mean, you can't surf the internet on your phone in Moscow. Why have they done that? Because he's afraid of getting taken out the way Khamenei was. He's afraid that's going to happen to him. that's a pretty terrible for a strong man to be cowering. And also, he's not even going into the Kremlin anymore. He's operating out of secret locations. He's effectively in hiding. Um, that shows real weakness. That shows fear. And so, he may be getting an economic reprieve, and he's happy that the Ukrainians aren't getting any more Patriot missiles, but you know he's hiding out in a basement somewhere. That tells you something.
I think what's really striking in this conversation is that we're just accepting that admittedly very bad people like Khamenei and Putin have either been just taken out, killed, assassinated, or are at risk of that happening to them. But where is international law? Is that legal?
There is no more international law. This is law of the jungle now. There is no more international law. I mean, there never really has been, but there's been sort of uh, an imprimatur, which the United States was responsible for sort of projecting, at least the idea that there was international law. But
It's
now that
always felt symbolic.
it always has been symbolic. The United States has always done whatever it wanted to do, but um, the United States was the country with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, with the National Endowment for Democracy, for, the USAID. United States was at least paying, I would say, reasonably strong symbolic lip service, except when it was very inconvenient to international law. Now it's just been thrown out the window. There is no international law. It's terrifying in a certain way for for the world, because God knows where this can all lead. I mean, you have the the Israelis bomb a gas field in Iran, and Iran doesn't retaliate against the Israelis. They bomb a gas field in Qatar. I mean, it's every man for himself. Everyone is just doing anything, and it's a very dangerous world, and probably going to get a lot more dangerous before we're done with this.
Well, because I mean, if we can do that to them, then they can do that to us. If that's happening to world leaders, then what does that mean for the rest of us who, speak out about human rights violations?
Nothing good. It means nothing good. It means that, and we're in a world now right now where atrocities are being committed so frequently that if something terrible happens to one of us or someone we know, it'll be one day's news, and then it's on to the next atrocity, the next terrible thing. Where it's as Stalin said, one person's death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic, and we're in that statistic world now, where stuff is so outrageous, so horrible, and so unreasonable that now, every man for himself, law of the jungle, the strong reign, the weak cower. That's the world we're in right now.
We recently had an Eritrean Swedish human rights activist on the show, Vanessa Tsaya. She won the Magnitsky Human Rights Award of the Year, so you'll
Yep.
be very familiar with her. Just going back to the Magnitsky Act itself, and the backstory. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because obviously, your lawyer, who effectively remained in Russia after you left, he had a pretty challenging time, one could say. So you pushed the Magnitsky Act to for I guess for his legacy ultimately. So can you just explore that a little bit more for us?
After I was kicked out of Russia in 2005, my offices were then raided by the police. I didn't understand why they were raiding the office. They seized a bunch of documents. I hired the smartest lawyer I knew in Russia at the time. He was 35 years old. His name was Sergei Magnitsky. He started to investigate, and he figured out that the reason for the office raid was they wanted to grab a bunch of our documents and then use those documents in a very complex fraud, in which the police, working with a bunch of other officials of the Russian government, stole $230 million of taxes that my firm had paid to the Russian government from the Russian government. And it's a complicated story, but basically he discovered this massive corruption involving $230 million. He figured the corruption out. He testified against the officials involved. He exposed the corruption. And in retaliation, they arrested him. They tortured him in police custody for 358 days, and then they killed him at the age of 37 in Russian police custody. And it was such a shock to me, such a heartbreak to me that somebody who worked for me, trying to do the right thing, would be deprived of his life in the most horrific way. That I gave up my life as a businessman, and I've spent since then. This was 2009, so 27 years now. I've been, I'm sorry, 16 years, not 27 years. 16, it feels like 27. 16 years, I've been working on a mission to get justice for him. And that led to something called the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act is a piece of legislation first passed in the United States and now in 35 countries around the world, which freezes the assets and bans the travel of human rights violators from Russia and all over the world, and particularly those uh, who killed Sergei Magnitsky, and that's become a tool for all sorts of victims, and it doesn't provide true justice. I mean, if somebody tortures and kills, taking away their visa and freezing their assets is not true justice, but it's a lot better than total impunity, which is what most of these bad people in dictatorships around the world enjoy. And it's very satisfying to watch how much they squirm and how upset they get when they get added to the Magnitsky Act. And it's also very heartening to see the victims getting some satisfaction and getting something when somebody does something terrible. And so this has been my life's work since the murder of Sergei Magnitsky. And of course, most importantly, his name is on this legislation, which means that it's his legacy. It's like a legal monument to his memory, and it means that although he ultimately paid the worst possible price, which is he gave his life, it wasn't a meaningless death. That his death and his sacrifice has given other people hope, and perhaps even dissuaded some people from doing terrible things in the future because they don't want to be sanctioned.
Mm. You described yourself as a former businessman. This might be a little bit of a controversial question, but I wonder, is the idea of being a human rights activist compatible with the business world in your view?
Definitely not. um, the moment that I mean, it's very interesting because I'm involved in a bunch of cases of different victims, and some cases falsely imprisoned people. And if they're falsely imprisoned in like rich countries, and I'm trying to go into those countries to get them out, or not, or putting pressure on the government, and I ask my business friends to join me in the campaign. They want to, they want as wide a berth as possible from me because it's not good for money to be looking for justice, and so it's definitely, yeah, you can't really do both. I mean, it's incompatible, I think.
So you, as part of your kind of, uh, I suppose, blending attempts to blend sort of human rights and business, you have this idea that there are 8 companies that, should they kind of band together, could really hurt Putin. Can you tell us about this?
Well, so this was an idea that I have been sort of a policy idea that I had been pitching before America's uh, Iran attacks, and the idea was that the war between Russia and Ukraine, Putin's war, had been going on for 4 years. The reason it had been going on for so long, even though they haven't made any progress, the Russians, was that Putin could afford to do it. He's a dictator. He doesn't care about loss of people. He really doesn't care at all. But more importantly, he had the money to do it. And then the question was, where did he get that money? And the answer is, it comes from the sale of oil. And then the question is, who is buying that oil? And what I discovered, and this was interesting, is that 80% of Russia's oil was purchased by 8 businesses. There were 2 oil refineries in China, uh, Sinopec and CNOOC, 4 oil refineries in India, and 2 in Turkey. And so my idea was, and this is before the Strait of Hormuz was closed, that if you were to impose an ultimatum on those 8 businesses to say, listen, I'm sure you enjoy getting your cheap Russian oil, and who wouldn't if you're an oil refinery, but um, if you don't find another source of oil in the next 3 months, then you're not going to be able to do any business in the United States, with Europe, with the United Kingdom, with Canada, with Japan. if you carry on after 3 months and 1 day. And, the idea was that none of these businesses would wanna, like, ruin their entire international profile because they wanted to get some cheap Russian oil, and they probably would have stopped buying the Russian oil, and if that had happened, the Russian oil would have been bought by somebody, but it would have been bought at $10 a barrel, and, Putin would have run out of money in 6 months. And so that was my idea, and I was at the Munich Security Conference. I pitched this to a number of foreign ministers and to a number of, US senators on both sides of the aisle, and I pitched this to, just about everybody, and everybody there wasn't a single person who said this is a bad idea. The only response I got was, "Well, that's so simple. Why aren't we doing that?" And so it was I was lining it up, and then this war started. Now with the Strait of Hormuz closed, oil prices up dramatically, 20 to 30% of world oil off the market. Nobody's going to want to mess around with anything at the moment, and so I don't think that it's a realistic possibility. Perhaps if this war is resolved, we can come back to it. But at the moment, it's all eyes on the Strait of Hormuz until that's sorted out.
Well, the war's not gonna last forever, hopefully. If you had an audience with President Trump right now, what would you advise him, keeping in mind that crisis does breed opportunity in a lot of ways?
Well, I guess from the vantage point of well, I mean, I'm not sure what to advise him on the Iran situation. I mean, it's such a complex story as far as I mean, if somehow the Americans can open up the Strait of Hormuz, then the Iranians have effectively lost their leverage. Um, and so that's got to be he's got to figure out how to do that. But I don't even know how it's possible. Every article I've read says that it's an asymmetric situation that all it takes is the fear of a tanker being bombed for insurance companies not to insure them, and for owners not to want to go through there. And if that happens, then how do you fix that? Um, on the Ukraine Russia story, it's I would advise him to do exactly the opposite of what he's been doing. Right now, he's been putting pressure on Ukraine to capitulate in favor of Putin, and I would say that it's very straightforward. And this is something not just that I'm saying. Any reasonable person who knows Russia, and this includes most of his Republican colleagues, would tell him the same thing, which is you need to completely strip Vladimir Putin of his economic ability to fight this war, and only then will he possibly negotiate a peace treaty. But certainly not by showing him that you're on his side and that Ukraine should be pressured into capitulating. That's a terrible idea, and one which is obviously not going to work.
What do you make of Trump's admiration, I guess we should call it, of Putin? Do you think is it simply a case of admiring strongmen, or is there something else, something a little bit deeper that might motivate that?
Well, I don't think there's a lot of deep stuff going on with Donald Trump. I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward. I mean, the Qataris gave him a $400 million airplane, and they got to build a Air Force base, inside sovereign territory of the United States. Um, I don't know what he's expecting from Vladimir Putin, but it's a lot bigger country than Qatar, and I think he's probably hoping for some similar benefit.
Mm. And speaking as a businessman, if the regime in Iran stays in place, whether they sort of keep the current structure or you have the military take over, how do you think that's going to impact the Gulf? I mean, these are huge economies, Saudi Arabia, UAE. Presumably, there would be some pretty big question marks when it comes to foreign investors for years to come if that happens, particularly relating to security.
Well, I think it's catastrophic for the Gulf if the regime does not collapse. You've got a situation where Iran. Let's say that Trump declares victory next week, and the Iranians say we're going to stop bombing the Strait of Hormuz, um, uh, and the regime stays intact. At any point, they could blackmail um, the world and blackmail uh, the Gulf countries, and close up the Strait of Hormuz again. And so it makes them sort of the gatekeeper to everything. That's just an unbelievable amount of leverage that they would have, and I would argue that even with everything decimated, that would put them in a stronger position if that were to happen than they were before. Um, and I think that would be pretty terrible. And so that is the problem with the situation. On one hand, you have potential economic cataclysm if this Strait of Hormuz stays closed, which gives a lot of people a lot of incentive, including Trump, who's um, not a long-term thinker, to just try to wiggle out of the situation. Um, but if that happens, it's the leverage that these people have would be terrible for the Gulf and for the rest of the world, that they could do this again at any point.
Just to flip Susie's earlier question, if you were advising leaders in the Gulf, I guess UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular, what would you be telling them at the moment in terms of how they interact with the White House, Iran?
Well, I mean, as I understand it, at least from the Saudi perspective, they're saying, you got to finish the job you started, because they can't do this half finished. If it's half finished, they end up in a worse place. Um, as painful as it is, as short-term painful as it is. I mean, these, in a certain way, they're under. I mean, they're under a huge pain because they've had to stop producing all the hydrocarbons that make them rich, but they've got a lot of savings. I would say that they've got to think that they've got to be thinking long term about this and bite the bullet at this point and figure out how to resolve this so that they're not constantly being blackmailed by the Iranians.
The message from inside Iran that I was getting in June was, why didn't they finish the job then? And so there really seems to be um, really no other choice than to actually finish the job. But my question is kind of on a zooming out, is this the moment where we finally recognize that our global dependence on oil on this level needs to be over?
Well, I think that the Chinese figured that out a long time ago. So which country has like um, majority electric cars? China. Why is that? It's not because they love electric cars. It's not like they love green energy. It's because they don't want to be dependent on oil. And I think that there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be saying, you know what, it may be more expensive to do solar or wind or whatever, but we need to, or nuclear, but we need to have, we can't be dependent on this stuff. And so I can imagine that it always takes these sort of global shocks. You have Fukushima, and the Germans turn off their nuclear power plants. Now you have the Strait of Hormuz, and everyone is going to be, turning on nuclear power plants and solar and other wind, and they're going to be doing that for the next 30 years because nobody wants to be put in this type of situation again.
I actually was in Shanghai a couple of years ago, and they very proudly took us to their EV factories. And I mean, I was truly blown away. Like, they are living light years ahead of us when it comes to electric vehicles. I think, to wrap up, I mean, Ukraine, I suppose, like, where does this go? What's your prediction? Like, in this moment, is there a way that this war in Iran could actually help the Ukrainians?
Well, first of all, the Ukrainians are not going to give up anytime soon. Ukrainians, as we speak, are actually taking more territory than they're losing. The Ukrainians now have a whole new set of possible alliances or people who depend on them for air defense. Um, Trump, who is trying to force an unreasonable deal down Zelensky's throat, is preoccupied, and so that whole quote peace negotiation has been put to the side. Um, Europe has figured out that they need to stand on their own 2 feet militarily, and the investments are now being made. And Germany has made a decision. This is before this war, but Germany made a decision to spend €1 trillion um, on their defense over the next decade. And so, the one thing I can say, people tend to oversimplify, and they tend to generalize. They said Russia's a superpower; they'll win this war with Ukraine in 3 days. Didn't happen. America is a superpower. They can just bomb Iran into oblivion. That nobody looked at the whole Strait of Hormuz situation. The Emiratis and the Saudis have bought so much missile defense, no one can touch them. Well, nobody thought about drones. So everything is not as it seems. And I think that the strong aren't as strong in the world. The weak aren't as weak. And so it's very hard to use these sort of simplistic generalizations about who the winners and losers should be, and then actually have those people be the winners and losers. But of course, I mean, the real loser in this situation have been the Ukrainian people and the Iranian people, who are all victims. And it's hard to see how anything is going to turn out in the short term good for either groups of people, and nobody seems to be paying much attention to the tens of millions of people in both countries who are living either in fear of bombs hitting them, or in fear in the Ukrainians' case, or a regime which are murdering their own people left, right, and center for just wanting a normal life. And that's really the tragedy of where we are in this lawless world right now.
What's your biggest hope for the future in terms of both of those conflicts? Do you see any openings?
I wish I could say that I see it. I mean, people ask me, what's my prediction in Ukraine? I say a year from now, the war will still be going on. I'm not enough of an expert on Iran to make any predictions, but it doesn't feel very good watching it from where I'm sitting for the people of Iran.
Sir Bill Browder, it's been great having you on. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And we want to encourage all of our viewers and listeners to tune in and subscribe to Global Power Shifts. That's Global Power Shifts at YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. See you again next time.